All right, we're official. So with that, I'd like to say hello and happy IINGAN Monday to everyone. Welcome to the Sierra Club's Wolf Awareness Week. We are very excited to host you this evening. My name's Amy Mueller. I'm on the Sierra Club Wildlife team, and just happy you could join us for this very special presentation tonight. We've got, what is happening there? Peter, are you maybe by chance sharing your screen? Oopsie, there we go. I think we got it. And then what I would like to cover here is just a couple of quick things. We've got time for questions at the end, I hope. So we've got the chat function enabled for this presentation. So if you'd like to put your questions in the chat as we go, I will scan those and I can ask Peter what questions we can get to, before time is up at 8 p.m. tonight. And then we are recording this, as you probably just got that little notification. So we'll be able to share the presentation in its entirety starting tomorrow morning. So look for that and feel free to share. And most importantly, before we begin, the Sierra Club of Wisconsin has the privilege and responsibility to acknowledge the Indigenous people who have called this land home for generations. There are now, this acknowledgement, demonstrates our strong commitment to collaborate and partner with the sovereign tribal nations located in Wisconsin. There are now 12 tribal nations that call this land home, 11 of which are federally recognized. No matter where you are in the state, you are on the ancestral land of a tribal nation. I would like to share with you the names of the people who were first to live, celebrate, and sing upon the land where I'm currently joining you from, which include the Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, Miami, Sioux, Sauk and Fox, Kickapoo, and Peoria. The Sierra Club of Wisconsin reminds us each to take the opportunity to learn about and appreciate the history of the land that we are on, and the great historical and present and future contributions of Indigenous people. And with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our host for this evening. Peter David is a retired wildlife biologist, formerly with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, or GLFWC, where he assisted the tribal members in the implementation of their off-reservation treaty rights, is what is now known in parts of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. He received his education, both a bachelor's and master's degree in wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and from the tribal elders and members for whom he has worked the last 35 years. At GLFWC, he had the opportunity to work with a variety of more than human things, from wolves to wild rice, and he likes to spend his free time with his wife, Lisa, friends, family, or even just himself outdoors. And I'd like to add personally that Peter is one of my favorite storytellers and is just an unbelievable wealth of knowledge. This past summer, I had the opportunity to hang out with him late at night up in the North Woods howling for wolves. And we had the unique experience of having a wolf pack with pups howl back in a chorus, which was just an unbelievable experience. So needless to say, I'm a big fan, and I'm super excited that Peter is spending IINGAN Monday with us. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Peter.
Well, thank you, Amy. Thanks for that introduction. Thanks to everyone who joined in tonight. Can you hear me all right? All right. Well,
yes.
Great. Thanks so much to share part of Wolf Awareness Week here, and for the invitation from Sierra Club. It's very welcome. I always enjoy talking about this topic here, about the Ojibwe's relationship with IINGAN, and I'm honored to be part of the series you have ahead of you this week. I always start these talks with a couple of caveats. As you may have guessed, I'm not Ojibwe, but as Amy mentioned, I worked on the tribe's behalf for over 35 years now, and over that time, I had the great pleasure and honor, really, of being taught so much by the tribal elders and other tribal members whom I was trying to work on behalf of. That being said, I will apologize for any shortcomings in my presentation or things that I could capture better. The shortcomings are wholly my own. I also do want to make clear that there is no single tribal relationship with IINGAN. It's personal and it's complex and it varies from person to person. And I've failed really if I've suggested otherwise. But I will say I think there's consensus on what I will try to present for you tonight. And importantly, it reflects in some ways not so much the relationship of individual Ojibwe members, but really it's sort of the story and the positions that have been described by tribal governments as a whole. And I think that's what really gives it weight. So I've got a lot to try to cover, and I'm going to try to share my screen here, and we'll get started. And hopefully that's visible to everyone. All right.
Looking good.
Well, I don't think it's any secret. See if I can get my first advance on it. The attitudes that many Europeans brought to North America when they came here. My ancestors certainly were amongst those that brought their perspectives from Europe and many of the mythologies associated with wolves, where wolves almost uniformly had a very negative connotation. Of course, we also know that there's portions of our society that put a tremendous value on wolves, almost revering them. And give them a lot of symbolic meaning of, the qualities of nature or the greatness of wilderness. I'm going to actually argue that the tribal relationship, the Ojibwe's relationship, is actually a little bit in between these two things. Wolves aren't necessarily so much up on a pedestal. There's certainly something you don't crush under your heel. But they're really something that is at your side. And in some ways, that's kind of a unique position because it's a little bit of a moderate one. And in some ways, there's not a lot of moderation when it comes to the world of wolves. So this position, I think, really has its initiation all the way back in the Ojibwe creation story. And that story has some parallels to the biblical creation story that I was raised with, and that there's a sequence to it. But instead of 7 days, there were 4 orders of creation. And in a quick and admittedly inadequate summary of that story, the first order of creation consisted of the real building blocks: the air, the land, the water, and fire. Perhaps in the form of the sun, perhaps in other forms. Those came in that first order of creation. And that, of course, created places for all of the plant beings that came in the second order, each placed where it would add the most beauty and value upon the earth. With those in place, it was now possible for that third order of creation to come. All of the animal beings, the feathered, the furred, the finned, the scaled. And with all of those beings in place, finally, in the fourth order came the last bit, and that was original man. And if he seems small and insignificant in this slide, that's because, in fact, he is. In the Ojibwe worldview, it's understood that we're the dependent and the most needy and are supposed to be the most humble being. Because while the rest of creation was doing really fine without us, the people were completely reliant upon the gifts of the earlier orders of creation. Unfortunately, those earlier orders took pity on this puny human being and agreed to provide. Now, that original man was given the task of naming all the species. And as he did this, he noticed that they generally came in pairs, but he was alone and had a loneliness of spirit. And when he discussed this with the Creator responded by providing not a woman, but a wolf to walk and to talk and to play with, the original man. And he gave them assignment. He sent them out to visit all of the earth's places together. And my tongue-in-cheek description of this is the original road trip, and the largest road trip ever. But during this trip, they saw all of the great beauty in nature, They saw all of the interconnectedness and relations that existed, and they discovered this very special relationship that they had with each other. And this is often been described as becoming like brothers. And some say that doesn't go far enough, that they were essentially two parts of a single being. So when that task was finished, they must have been very surprised when they went back to the Creator and were told that now they had to go their own paths. But their fates would be forever intertwined. And I guess if you don't remember anything else from this lecture tonight, try to remember that, because it's really this understanding of intertwined fates that's fundamental to understanding the Ojibwe's view towards IINGAN. Now, when we say the term Indian treaties, most people think about the land secession treaties. But the original treaties for the Anishinaabe were these treaties made with the species that they depended upon, like the deer, the wild rice, and the wolf, all of these more than human beings. And this relationship with IINGAN really defined what was in that treaty with them. The people here were really the weaker partner in this treaty, but like any treaty, there were then and still are responsibilities on both sides. Wolves had several roles, but they were tremendous educators. They taught the Ojibwe how to survive on this harsh landscape that we have here. As abundant as it can be in the summertime, we all know that the months ahead are going to be hard ones. So how to hunt, how to have stamina, how to work cooperatively, how to raise your young in extended family groups. And we see that still in Ojibwe families and the important role of the aunties and uncles. IINGAN also kept the deer herd healthy. And by doing that, they also helped protect the populations of some plants, including important medicinal plants. The Ojibwe maybe didn't have as much to offer, but they could commit to certain things. They needed to view the wolf as their brother, to treat them with respect, to think of their best interests, and to be appreciative and humble when accepting these benefits that IINGAN provide. So now I want to tell you a history that you're probably already familiar with. I'm sure many people on the call, the history of wolves in Wisconsin. But I want to try to maybe tell you that same story from a little different angle and try to the best of my ability to show it from an Ojibwe perspective and try to explain why this story might have different meaning to Ojibwe than it may not hold for other people. Now, if we go back far enough, maybe early European contact period, it's been estimated that there were perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 wolves in this area that we now consider Wisconsin. The entire area, north, south, east to west, was suitable wolf habitat and was occupied by wolves. If you jump up to the mid-1800s, this is this time period when some of these important treaties with the United States were signed. And in northern Wisconsin, these two particular treaties ceded significant areas of land. And it wasn't long after these treaties were signed in 1848 that some of this area became formally now parts of the state of Wisconsin, roughly the northern third. If you leap ahead about another century, we find that by 1950, only about 1% of Wisconsin's wolf population still remained. And by 1960, which was 1 year after Vince Lombardi arrived in Green Bay, and 1 year actually after I was born into Green Bay, Wisconsin was wolfless. And I suspect at that time, many people were more concerned about the future of the Packers than the demise of the wolves. We know, of course, why this happened. Wolves were extremely heavily persecuted, and it turns out really not very hard to kill. And we know that in part because they were wiped out from essentially all of the lower 48, from vast areas that they occupied, with the exception of a small patch that remained in northern Minnesota adjacent to Canada. And it's a little bit of an aside, but it's worth remembering that as easy as it was to kill wolves then, it's certainly far easier to do it today. Now, the story, I think, gets rather interesting in 1974 when two invisible political boundaries were crossed. The first crossing, perhaps, was done by these two folks, Mike and Fred Tribble, who were two brothers from the Lucoutere Reservation. This picture of them is from somewhat later in their life, and they look like a couple of hellions, I know. But they were, the two brothers were taking a course in Indian law when they were younger at St. Scholastica in Duluth. And in the course of that class, they read the language in the treaties. And this, what seemed to be fairly straightforward language about that the tribal representatives had retained these rights at the time of the treaty, that the treaties were signed about hunting and fishing and gathering from the entirety of the ceded territory. And so they asked their professor, what happened? Why can't we exercise these rights today? And the instructor said, well, basically you need a test case. You have to go out and get arrested. And so the Tribbles decided to go ice fishing on the wrong side of the lake. They chose Chief Lake, which was partly on the Lucoutere Reservation and partly off. But they went to the part of the lake that was off the reservation. Now that invisible line running across the lake probably didn't mean very much to the fish that were swimming down beneath the ice, but it did mean something to the DNR wardens, who came in and did their duty and arrested the Tribbles for fishing without a state license. And for the Tribbles, this was essentially mission accomplished. It's kind of interesting to realize that the entire reaffirmation of the tribe's off-reservation treaty rights began with that simple little event. Interestingly, in that same year, not impossibly on the same date, and not impossibly including two brothers, wolves crossed the invisible boundary between the states of Minnesota and Wisconsin. And a small pack took up residence in Douglas County, somewhat south of Superior, Wisconsin. Now, the Endangered Species Act had passed just the previous year. And so these newly arriving wolves, which had been, subject to a bounty for nearly a century, now we're going to have significant protections. And I think it's really interesting to think about the motivation for both of these acts, because I think it was really similar. I think both the Tribbles and the IINGAN were really seeking a better opportunity for themselves and for future generations. And interestingly, many people saw these similarly, but actually from two very different viewpoints. Some people did see both of these things essentially as forms of recovery. The tribes were taking steps to recover parts of their traditions and their cultures and their practices. And wolves were coming back and recovering and reoccupying a little piece of the land that they'd been exterminated from. However, people as old as me remember that there were also many people who saw this in a very different light. And they saw both of these things as tremendous threats to the state's natural resources. Wolves were going to come in here and wipe out the deer herd. Tribes exercising their treaty right were probably going to wipe out a whole host of different species. And one thing that's kind of amazing to me is that nearly half a century later, many people still hold on to both of these false ideas. So what happened? Well, the first 20 years were a significant struggle for wolves. And despite the protections of the Endangered Species Act, the population barely moved, and gunshot wounds were actually the leading cause of death. And the wolves, in a sense, weren't alone in their struggles, because the tribe's initial efforts to recover their treaty rights were met with tremendous opposition as well. Fortunately, the gunfire aimed in the general direction of tribal spears was aimed over their heads. Pipe bombs planted at the boat landings were discovered before they went off. As a person born into Wisconsin, I was not proud of my home state and the overt racism that came to the surface at this time. But as bad as it was then, I actually kind of shudder to think what would be the case that it unfolded under some of the political climate that we've had more recently. Now, in 1989, opposition to the treaty rights was kind of coming to a peak with these violent protests, particularly at boat landings. And Wisconsin Governor Tommy Thompson sought an emergency order to halt the exercise of the treaty right. indicating that he'd rather shut down the spring tribal spearing season than bring in the National Guard to act as peacekeepers. Fortunately, federal judge Barbara Crabb ruled against that. And basically you can read her quote here, but just indicated that we can't just essentially let lawlessness determine what people's rights are. Another really important step came still here in 1989. A lot of people believe that sort of the early exercises that were being reestablished of the Self-Preservation Treaty rights were not so much about recovering traditional practices as it was about upping the ante for an eventual buyout from the state. And indeed, Wisconsin eventually ponied up a substantial offer to the Lac du Flambeau tribe. This is the most active spearing tribe. The tribe's name, after all, derives from this traditional practice of taking fish at night by torchlight. This offer from the state even included per capita payments to all tribal members, most of which were not active tribal spearers. And when the tribe rejected that offer, I really think it sent a strong message to the public that the tribes were serious about preserving these rights and traditions. Now, after some initial setback, the tribes began to have greater success in the courts. And perhaps not coincidentally, the wolf population also started to respond in some positive ways. In 1991, when the Wisconsin treaty rights case, final judgment, often referred to as the Voigt case, was decided, the IINGAN population still had puttered along only to reach about 40 wolves. By 1999, there was a case unfolding in Minnesota. It was a similar case, actually based on part of the same treaty area, the 1837 treaty area. That case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and that court ruled in favor of the tribes. And by that point, the Wisconsin wolf population had tipped just over 200 animals. Incidentally, 1999 was also the year that basically Wisconsin's existing wolf management plan was written. So it gives you a little sense of how far behind the times we are. Then the population really took off. And by 2012, or about 2 decades after the treaty rights had been reaffirmed, the population topped 800. And at that point, wolves in the Midwest were taken off the endangered species list. And on that very day that they came off the list, harvest legislation was introduced in Wisconsin. This law required the state to have a wolf season anytime wolves were not on either the state or federal endangered species list. And this led to Wisconsin having its first wolf hunting and trapping season in over half a century in the fall of 2012. Delisting also made it legal to have lethal depredation control on wolves in Wisconsin. And so now you had essentially 2 significant new forms of mortality taking place on the wolf population. And over this 3-year period from 2012 to 14, it's pretty remarkable that there were over 800 known wolf mortalities in the state, the majority of them coming from the recreational harvest season. And I highlight year 2013 there in particular. That was the year that the state set an unusually high quota. And with 364 known mortalities that year, it had taken the state of Wisconsin 30 years for the population to grow from 0 to 360, the number killed in that single year. I should mention that the tribes had the legal right to harvest wolves. They could have laid claim to half of the biologically sound quota from the ceded territory, but for both cultural and ecological reasons, refused to kill wolves. And very shortly after the 2014 season ended, a successful legal challenge to the delisting there put these wolves in the Great Lakes region back on the endangered species list. And with that, the IINGAN population, after bouncing back from this initial decline, that dip you can see that was associated with that hunting period, The wolf population grew again, and just barely by 2020 actually reached for the first time a 4-digit level in Wisconsin. And very likely was approaching what biologists call K, or carrying capacity, where the population was likely to stop growing. It's certainly a significant number, but still is probably no more than a third of the wolves that existed in Wisconsin prior to European contact. And just one other little point I'd like to throw in for perspective here, in the approximately 45 years that it took the wolf population here to increase to a 4-digit number, the Wisconsin population, the human population in the state, increased by approximately 1.3 million people. I'm sure many people on the call are familiar, of course, that then in January of 21, IINGAN were delisted again, this time not just in the Great Lakes region, but actually all the way from Maine to California. In the light gray shaded area here shows that historic range of the gray wolf. There were, with the exception of that area in the Rocky Mountains, which had been previously delisted, and the area where the Mexican wolf recovery program is underway, this tremendous coast-to-coast delisting took place. And I'll say that the Ojibwe certainly are glad that IINGAN have made a significant recovery here in the Midwest, but their relationship with wolves doesn't end at the ceded territory line. Without getting into too many of the gory details, I think many people again are familiar that because of the existence of this must-have-a-hunting season law in Wisconsin, the state was pushed into having a season in February of 21. The DNR initially did not want to have the season. They were going to take the time necessary to consult with the tribes and with the public and to develop a good, sound set of regulations. But a lawsuit by a group called Hunter Nation pushed them into having a rapidly and poorly implemented season, and also essentially caused the state to forego the consultation that they're required by federal law to have with the tribes. They were going to violate either the state court or the federal court, and they decided to go and violate the federal case. There are a number of problems with this February season. I believe that the harvest model that was used, first of all, to establish the quota is inappropriate and overly liberal. There was actually human error involved that also resulted in that quota being set even higher than the model would have prescribed. But the really biggest problems with this is that this season took place when the wolf population is at its lowest point in the annual cycle, and at the same time that wolves are breeding. Okay, so it essentially assured that all of the harvest was going to be additive to all other forms of mortality that wolves were subject to. And the negative impacts of the season would really extend into future years by reducing recruitment of new pups into the population. And I think that the impact of that is still not over. And then, of course, the final major black mark on this was that the state was not able to control the harvest and exceeded its quota of 119 by 99 wolves, or 83%. There were many people appalled by this, but I'll say this much: had the tribes gone in and exceeded their quota of something by 83%, there would have been a massive uproar about it. 20% of the state's wolf population killed in less than 3 days. Now, it gets a little tricky to tell you how this affected the population, because right at the same time, the DNR changed the way it counts wolves in the state. And so my next figure, instead of going back to my old graph, I'm going to show you a document straight out of the Wisconsin DNR recent report. And they went from doing what was called a minimum count, where they essentially made an effort to try to count every wolf in the state, to doing a thing called an occupancy model. And that's why in that year 2020, you can see both the minimum count estimate, which was 1,034, and the estimate made by this occupancy model. The one thing that the bars, if you're not into, if it's been a while since you've been in a statistics class, the bars shown there over those last three numbers are the confidence interval, and basically indicate that there's a 95% chance that the actual wolf population falls between the high end and the bottom end of those bars. And then the number in the middle is the most likely single figure that might exist in the state. But it's considered better by some because it estimates the entire population. We knew we missed some animals when we were trying to do the minimum survey counts. But it has these substantially wide confidence intervals around it. I won't go into a lot of detail now, but one thing I will point out, down on the bottom, the blue line is the estimated number of packs. And you can see that the 256 figure there, that was the estimated number of packs from the intensive ground survey. And I will say this, they put a tremendous amount of effort into doing that ground survey. The 316 figure is the estimated number of packs using the new methodology. And it would suggest that somehow, despite the intensive effort that was put into that ground survey, the state was missing 60 wolf packs. And I think there's some questions about whether that's really the case. Now, in February of just this year, wolves then again rejoined the endangered species list following another successful legal challenge to the delisting. So the teeter-totter here continues. If I give this talk next week, it might be different again. So it's something you really have to stay on top of and monitor. Now, I'd like to take a good chunk of my remaining time and actually talk about a very important topic that's quite distasteful for many people, but I would like to talk a bit about why should we hunt wolves. As I mentioned, the tribes have been very opposed to the recreational harvest of wolves. And yet we have in Wisconsin this law that requires a season anytime wolves are not on the endangered species lists. And what are the arguments that are commonly given for that? And what are some of the Ojibwe perspectives on these arguments? Four of the commonest arguments sort of deal with or consider wolves basically as being a problem. And I refer to these as the four horsemen of the wolf apocalypse. And the things we hear oftentimes are that wolves are a threat to human safety, that they are decimating the deer herd, that if we don't control the population, we're going to have wolves everywhere. People see that population growth curve going up. And then the depredation issues with livestock and occasionally pets. The term that's usually used here is this public health and safety. We need to control wolves because they're inherently dangerous. And I think it's rooted in that old mythology, that goes back to the only good wolf is a dead wolf. But we know that this issue isn't really about safety. Wolves present a minimal safety risk compared to other things that we live with every day. It's about fear, and I think in most regards, an unreasonable fear. Certainly, we should treat all wild animals with respect, but other animals and events that we sort of interact with daily present much greater threat. Bees, lightning strikes, dogs, cattle are far more likely to cause you harm. And we shouldn't really feed, I don't think, this fear, but we should treat it through education. I would also note that, in those rare cases where an animal is acting in a threatening manner, perhaps some foolish person started feeding a wolf or habituating it, it's really important to act then and there with the individual animal that's a threat. Having a general hunting season really doesn't, it's kind of a meaningless approach to this issue, even where it does exist. Now, the second one is this idea that we're going to have, we're going to be saturated with wolves. It's always a little bit amusing to me. I live in a small town of about 2,000 people that you barely notice probably when you drive through, and I'm up in Washburn, Wisconsin, in the far north. And I think about if you took my community and you basically cut it in half and you spread it out over a third of the state, I don't think anybody would think that was a very high human density. But people have a different perspective sometimes towards wolves. But The bottom line is we know that this argument is really kind of, it's biologically just totally unreasonable or unsound. Wolves are highly territorial animals. They're extremely good at limiting their own numbers. The population in Minnesota has stopped growing even without a hunting season. The same is true in Michigan. And as I said, we were probably very likely within close range of carrying capacity here in Wisconsin before the February season. I'd also note that it's actually, from a biological perspective, it's a nice thing to know what carrying capacity is. And the best way to know that is not to guess at it or to model it, even though that kind of work has been done. The best thing to do would be to let the wolves tell us by leaving them alone enough until their own population stabilizes. Now, Wisconsin is a huge deer hunting state. And a lot of people are concerned about the impacts of wolves on deer. This chart is an old one. It's from the DNR. It is quite a bit out of date, and animal populations change and trend over time. The wolf population has increased here by about 50% from this one. So if I crudely extend that bar a little bit, there's probably about 20,000 deer killed by wolves in Wisconsin now in a typical year. But you can see that when you put that piece of harvest in the big picture with hunter harvest, with the impacts from overwinter stress, with the estimated bear kill, coyote kill, vehicle strikes, bobcat kills, even killing fawns, that there's just, it just doesn't make sense that somehow wolves are driving the number of deer that we have on the landscape. But they're a very easy sort of scapegoat, I think, to point to. There's also some other things that go on here. You know, having more wolves on the landscape means fewer coyotes. So there's actually probably been a reduction in that. So there's sort of a compensatory thing taking place here by having wolves on the landscape. And of course, I'm sure many people on the call are aware that wolf harvest is also very different from human harvest. You know, humans tend to try to pick out the biggest, healthiest, strongest animals that they can, while wolves are essentially the pruners of the population. They're taking out the sick, the weak, the elderly. That doesn't apply always, but it's definitely a general trend because killing even a deer is a significant risk for a wolf. If you take a little bit of a look at the data, the black line in this image is the 3-year running average of the post deer season population estimate for the Wisconsin DNR's northern forest zone, which includes most of Wisconsin's wolf population. And you can see that that population has gone up and down and varied a fair bit, moving mostly in response to weather conditions and with human harvest levels. The red line is what the wolf population is doing over this same period. It's not, I don't have it on an axis, I just kind of taped this on top of the other diagram. But you can see that the wolf population increased threefold, and yet it really didn't seem to have any appreciable impact on this post-hunt harvest level. And there's almost identical data that's coming out of Michigan as well. It just doesn't show this correlation. And in Minnesota, where wolves have been established for longer than either of the other two states, it really looks like what you might expect, which is that wolf numbers track deer numbers. Okay, so wolves don't determine the number of deer you have so much as the number of deer, and particularly vulnerable deer that you have, determines the number of wolves you can have. Now we have the issue of depredations. You know, depredations are a real issue. Wolves certainly will kill livestock under certain conditions. And it's a particular loss if it's happening to you. But again, we know that a general recreational hunting season isn't really an effective way to address this when it does occur, in part because it's not timely, right? If I'm losing a calf in the spring, having a hunting season come fall doesn't necessarily do me a lot of good. And it's also not targeted. You know, people don't go to these depredation locations to do their hunting. For example, after the 2021 season, an analysis by Wisconsin's Green Fire found that out of the 218 wolves killed in that season, only 4% were killed within 5 miles of the previously documented depredation location. And more than and approximately 84% were more than 10 miles from a depredation. So the wolves being harvested were not the wolves which were causing people trouble. In fact, only about 10 to 15% of Wisconsin's packs are involved in depredation. And so, to me, this is like saying, if I've got a shoplifting problem in my store, I'm going to deal with it by keeping random customers from coming in. It's really not a very effective tool. So hunting doesn't help, but there are effective programs, that provide response from animal damage control, both non-lethal and lethal, at least during periods of delisting, and growingly some efforts at preventative techniques. The bear dog issue is a little harder to address. Wolves on average kill about 20 hunting dogs a year in Wisconsin and injure about half that many. Most of these occur not during the hunting season, but during the training season, when these dogs are running in packs in areas where wolves have pups that they're very interested in protecting. Wisconsin's become a mecca for hound hunters. It has a very long training season, and it has very liberal baiting regulations. And these baiting sites also seem to become focal points for negative interactions between wolves and dogs. The dog losses could actually be reduced by shortening the training and these baiting periods. That's the case in Michigan, and losses are much less there. But hounders like the season that they have, and they would rather drive down the wolf population, and essentially are proposing killing 2 out of every 3 wolves in the state of Wisconsin. And you can imagine what that would be, how devastating that would be to a highly social animal like wolves. Now, the 5th reason that's sometimes given for a season is, hey, can't we manage wolves just like any other harvestable resource? Now that's, I won't even touch upon how culturally abhorrent that is, I guess, from an Ojibwe perspective. But I would argue that even outside of that, this argument doesn't hold up. It turns out that the collective amount paid by hunters and trappers for the right to kill a wolf really greatly exceeds the value of the pelts that are taken. Given the price that pelts are at right now, it's about 10 times more that the hunters and trappers are paying for their licenses and permits. So in the end, really what the state is providing here is either a trophy or a novelty experience, kill an animal you've never killed before, or for some people, it's an act of vengeance against wolves. I would say that certainly isn't consistent with the Ojibwe worldview, and it's really not consistent with very many people in the sport hunting ethic who believe that you need to have a legitimate reason to take an animal's life, any animal's life, but especially perhaps one as social and sentient as IINGAN. I'm going to skip probably a little bit quickly here. My time, I think, is getting close. And I know this audience is going to be familiar with many of the benefits that IINGAN provides, but certainly helping support the health of forest ecosystem and this regeneration of certain plant and tree species. Probably the most important tool that we have to limit the expansion of chronic wasting disease into the ceded territories in northern Wisconsin. And perhaps we can't talk about more of the science that's rapidly unfolding in that area. But wolves are on the landscape. They can detect this disease. They can keep those prions from being spread, and they're doing it 365 days of the year. There's also been modeling work to suggest that wolves can help reduce the prevalence of tick diseases, which are a huge issue in Wisconsin, through this trophic cascade of reducing that coyote population, as I mentioned, which actually allows the fox population to increase. And it's fox that are really the efficient mousers on the rodents that are carrying the ticks. Really interesting study that came out just last year that found that wolves reduce car deer accidents where they're found. And they do this primarily by changing the behavior of deer. And this study found that the savings in car repair bills was 63 times higher than the verified losses experienced by the livestock industry. The study didn't even try to estimate things like the cost of hospital bills and the occasional loss of human life in these accidents. And curiously, this study also suggests another form of compensation because some of these deer are also being saved now by being kept off of the highway. And of course, there's the simple cultural significance and the intrinsic value of wolves have. That wolves are their own being, and their existence doesn't have to depend upon the values that we put upon them. This cultural perspective, sometimes poo-pooed the tribal perspective towards wolves, but there's a totally parallel example in the non-tribal community. When bald eagles came off the Endangered Act, we didn't pass a law to start hunting them. We had a law already in place to protect them under the Bald Eagle and Golden Eagle Act, not because biologically they were so unique, but because they held tremendous cultural value. And certainly the tribal members, the Ojibwe, and many other people feel the same should be true for IINGAN. And then I end with a question mark because I just would like to point out one of the primary Ojibwe teachings is to be humble, to remember that position. And in this context, it's really important to remember we're going to know more about wolves 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now. It's just amazing how much knowledge is being picked up all the time. And in that scenario, you also have to just say, perhaps being humble recognizes that there may be vast values of wolves that we just aren't even cognizant of. And maybe the right approach is to assume that something that's been on this landscape for thousands of years before they were exterminated have benefits and functions that we are yet to discover. So what's ahead? I think this is entirely up to us. Here in the US, in the lower 48 in particular, the future of wolves is entirely in our hands. It seems like a full circle. We control the future of wolves, and our own fate perhaps is tied to that of wolves. Now, as negative as parts of this presentation might be, in many ways, I'm optimistic. We're in a remarkable place at this time. There is a robust and largely ecologically functioning wolf population in Wisconsin right now at a level that we didn't really expect to see even 20 years ago. The science, the understanding is growing all the time. And really importantly, more and more evidence that the public is understanding and accepting and welcoming wolves on the landscape. So I think that gives us reason to be optimistic here. And I'll kind of end by saying, I do think this is important to get it right. We certainly have a responsibility to care for stewarding IINGAN. But I think sometimes we do them a disservice by laying all of the symbolism on them. But I do think if we can get this relationship right, it really bodes well for embracing more of this Ojibwe worldview, or maybe what Elder Leopold, referred to as a land ethic of having the right relationship with the non-human community. And with that, I'll just say miigwech, or thank you. And I think we still do have about 10 minutes or so for questions if people have any.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's good to hear the optimistic outlook with the turbulence, particularly I think in the last year and a half. Hearing that from you is very reassuring. So we do have a couple, I think, excellent questions in the chat that I will try to jump into and just sort of tee up for you. We had one question, I think, and I've heard this too. The tribes, especially the Ojibwe, that filed the federal lawsuit last year that demonstrated such excellent leadership. What are things we can do to help support them in those efforts, Peter? Do you know of any good places to direct us in terms of contacts or websites?
Well, there's a number of ways you can do that. In the general sense, of course, helping wolves helps the Ojibwe. So anything that benefits wolves is really important in that regard. And it's kind of funny, as a biologist, if you ask me about other things I've worked on over my life, wild rice and ducks and turkeys, and the usual response is habitat, habitat, habitat. When it comes to wolves, it's unfortunately, it's political. Get involved on a political scale. Push hard for political reform. People are, I'm sure, are aware of this debacle going on with the Natural Resources Board here in Wisconsin. There's a tremendous need to recreate that thing in a way that it actually represents the average public of Wisconsin like it's supposed to, not just the hook and bullet organizations. There are a number of groups very active in lawsuits supporting the tribes, and you can find those organizations and offer them your financial support if that's an opportunity for you. But it really is true. The biggest forms of wolf support right now mean going to and pushing as hard as you can against politicians, because this is really what's driving so much of what's going on in Wisconsin right now.
Yeah, absolutely. We had another question from Scott that said, we have both CWD and wolves in Adams County. How do I numerically measure that relationship? Are there models in the literature that measures this relationship? And I think, so often we think the CWD hasn't reached areas where there are wolves. It sounds like that's kind of a unique situation there.
Yeah, I mean, this is a hard thing to collect some of the science on, because in fact, there's not a lot of overlap between CWD range and areas that have good wolf populations. And so the science is sort of catching up here, I think. There are things, though, that give us all kinds of inklings that this is an effective tool at any rate. They're training dogs to detect CWD. And if you can train a dog to do it, I'm pretty darn sure wolves have been doing it for a very long time.
Oh, yeah.
There have also been studies with cougars that look at prey selectivity, and they find that cougars, for example, select infected animals at a higher rate than human hunters do. And because of different hunting techniques, cougars are ambushers, wolves are chasers, that wolves are probably even more selective than cougars. There was another cougar study that fed CWD infected meat to the cougars and found that some 98% roughly of the prions were broken down by doing that. Now, that study hasn't been replicated with wolves yet, but certainly strong reason to think that that might be the case there as well. So you'll have to probably talk to some much smarter, younger biologists as to how to gather more of the data to support this, and to even make determinations of things like, what level or density perhaps of wolves do we need to be effective at doing this. I had a great concern in that February season, because in January of 21, the first positive CWD in Shawano County, Wisconsin, was announced by the DNR. A month later, that wolf season took place, and it turns out that essentially the entire wolf pack closest to that positive location was wiped out in that season. And you just have to wonder about whether that's creating holes essentially in the line of defense against this disease. But it's hard to study. But it seems like, we're just not very sophisticated in the way these harvests have been implemented.
Right. Oh, absolutely. I appreciate that. I'm not to put you on the spot with this one, but I'll ask you, this is an opinion. Peter, what do you think the chances are that the law, that Act 169, that requires the wolf hunt in Wisconsin could be repealed, at least while they're protected on the ESA right now? Do you have any thoughts on how difficult that could be to overcome? I know, from what I understand, I think that's a long haul, but you've certainly been around this a long time.
Well, and I don't know that I'm the right person to have a great opinion on that. It's strange to be, I consider myself at least somewhat of a wolf biologist, and to have to deal with things like political gerrymandering. When politicians are in positions where they have very little chance of not being reelected, it leads to these sorts of extremes in government, in all sorts of forms of government, I think. And it's going to take a lot of work. And actually, I think it probably starts with an effort of having a bipartisan party determine the political boundaries for elections in this state.
Yeah, no, that's fair. One question, I know we know wolves move and they're kind of hard to track all the time, but what are maybe just real rough estimates of the number of wolves that are actually primarily on tribal protected lands? Do you have any ballpark figures on that?
Well, in terms of actually being on reservation lands in Wisconsin, there's probably no animal in Wisconsin that lives its entire life on a reservation.
Okay.
There are some animals that live primarily on reservations, but even that number is quite small and probably in the range of less than 50 in a typical year. And it's one of the reasons why the tribes, I think, also have interests perhaps in trying to close certain areas of public land to wolf harvesting. You know, the treaty right is essentially limited to public lands at this time. And so the very places where the tribes are most reliant upon the ecological benefits that wolves provide are the places that, one, most people think are optimal for wolves, large blocks of public land, but two, are actually being the ones which are being predominantly harvested. You know, more of the harvest is coming from those lands than from private lands, and so it's kind of a backwards way of managing, in my mind.
Yeah, that's where they're just fulfilling their ecological benefits, right? That's where they're
Right.
just being a wolf. Well, we'll do just two more here. I've got a little lighter one. Later in the week on Friday, we're doing our favorite wolf movies. And goodness knows, I know you've been around this and you've studied and you have a lot of experience. Do you have a favorite wolf movie or documentary that you would recommend wolf lovers take in this wolf?
You know, actually, I hardly watch movies. I hardly watch TV. I would recommend go out and make your own movie. Go stand in the woods and try to find a place and give a howl and have a direct experience. But that reflects my ignorance of what's out there. I know there's some really wonderful films too.
You can't beat that. And then one last question. How many years do you think we would need to have no hunting, like essentially right now where we are protected in the Great Lakes from the lethal removals and the recreational hunting? How many years do you think we would need to let things ride to possibly understand that carrying capacity?
I don't think very many. If there was protection here from hunting and lethal depredation control, but particularly hunting, I wouldn't be surprised at 5 years if we hadn't reached carrying capacity. Now, it might take you several more years to be convinced that you've reached it. You know, you usually want multiple years of sort of plateauing. But even, you know, in Minnesota, where there's no recreational harvest, but there was lethal control and at significant efforts. I mean, they were killing a couple of hundred wolves or more a year. That population still eventually plateaued, and that certainly would happen here too.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's anyone's guess if we will be able to get to that point, but you know, there's hope. Well, with that, Peter, I will say thank you. I know there's maybe a few other questions. We will try to get that information out through the rest of the Wolf Awareness Week communications that we have. But thank you all so much for your great questions. And I'll just wrap up by saying we have a lot of fun activities throughout the week. Tomorrow is Test Yourself Tuesday. So we have a really interactive, dynamic test through an app called Kahoot. And you'll be able to compete. You can test yourself and have your friends and family get their scores and have bragging rights for whoever knows them the best. Especially if you've attended tonight here with Peter, you've got a leg up. And Wednesday, we have another live Zoom presentation at 7 p.m. and it's Wolf Talk Wednesday with another wolf legend in our state, Adrian Weideven. And he'll be talking in depth a little bit more on the wolf biology, ecology, and wolf policy. And he gets really into his experiences being in the DNR and watching the wolf population recover like we saw in Peter's presentation. So please mark your calendars for that. And with that, I just so appreciate all of you being here this evening to celebrate IINGAN Monday. And Peter, thank you for all that you do and for being the voice of wolves and for helping us understand the creation story. It's such a beautiful, beautiful story that you tell us. So thank you. I think we've all learned a lot. So I will close it with that, but I will stay on if anyone has anything additional, but I think we're good to go. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate having the opportunity, and everyone have a wonderful night.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
All right, there we go.
Thank you very much for your time and efforts.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being here.
Good night.